Right, good afternoon again from London. Dr. Dermot Hudson, Chairman of the Juche Idea Study Group, here again. Thought I'd come back and make a second video about particularly toxic and insidious form of anti-DPRK propaganda. And of course, we all know that anti-communism took on new forms since the collapse of, or the frustration of socialism in some countries during the period 1989 to 1991. Some old forms of anti-communist propaganda disappeared, but new and dirtier, more toxic forms of anti-communist propaganda appeared. And the DPRK, is the leading socialist state, the most advanced socialist country, has tended to take the brunt of this kind of postmodernist liberal propaganda that sort of turned out on an industrial scale. And the other day, I got into some discussion on Twitter with some kind of right-wing Hungarian academic who is associated with the NK News gang. And of course, as we all know, NK News is a front of the US Central Intelligence Agency and the South Korean National Intelligence Service, and is linked to other intelligence agencies, and has all sorts of reactionaries on its staff and sort of professional DPRK bashers. Anyway, this whole thing was about the question of mixed marriages in the DPRK and the question of nationality in the DPRK. And this was sparked off in turn by a very bad book, a really truly horrendous book written by someone called Brian Reynolds Myers, who is an American living in South Korea, teaches at South Korean University. And I think it needs to be remarked on that a lot of the really vile rubbish about the DPRK is written by Americans and Europeans who are staying in South Korea and teach at South Korean universities. Their salaries are paid by the South Korean state. So he who pays the piper calls the tune. And Myers is the son of a US Army officer. He's lived in apartheid South Africa as well. And he produced a horrendous book about the DPRK, real heap of slander, called Cleanest Race, arguing that DPRK follows an ethno-nationalist policy that, Koreans see themselves as superior to other races, which is nonsense. And basically, Myers is a real spokesman for US imperialism in Korea and a spokesman of US neo-colonialism. In fact, Myers not only attacked the DPRK, but he attacked anti-imperialist and patriotic South Koreans who want to see the US chased out of South Korea. He actually attacks them as well as the DPRK. So I think you can see where he's coming from. But anyway, there's actually no laws in the DPRK that prohibit interracial marriage. This has been falsely claimed, but there is no such law. And I don't know if people can see this clearly, the DPRK law on nationality of 1964, which clearly states in Article 6, foreigners can acquire DPRK nationality by their request, regardless of nationalities and races. Article 7, even when a DPRK citizen is married to a person without DPRK nationality, his or her nationality shall not be changed. So, in fact, actually, in the DPRK, under that law, those DPRK citizens married to non-DPRK citizens actually enjoy some legal protection. So it's basically a total falsehood. Anyway, this Hungarian character went on and tried to say, well, there were secret directives and edicts about mixed marriages, and dredged up a load of gossip and hearsay from the Hungarian archives. Now, several comments about this. Firstly, it's a well known fact that the archives in former socialist countries are very dodgy. There's been cases where material has been fabricated, to make money. Some people have doctored the archives to prove whatever the West wants them to say, and that was the case with the Soviet archives. With these Hungarian archives that are quoted, it alleged various incidents in the DPRK around, people who were married to foreigners. And I say it's very much hearsay. And people have got to understand that in the early 1960s, the tensions between the DPRK and its so-called allies, like the Soviet Union and East European socialist countries, were actually very tense. With China and Albania, both those countries actually experienced open splits with the Soviet Union and were subjected to all kinds of things. With the DPRK, it didn't get that far, but it was in a fact that in 1962, the Soviet Union imposed its own form of sanctions on the DPRK, ending military cooperation and trying to end economic cooperation and cutting some supplies off. So it was quite tense. And DPRK needed to defend itself from the infiltration of revisionism and from maneuvers of the Soviet Union, the great power chauvinists. And what some people have done is to try and say the DPRK's anti-revisionism, anti-imperialism, and resist anti-great power chauvinism is a form of nationalism, which again is total rubbish. The DPRK just wanted independence for itself to build socialism of its own style, and this had nothing to do with racism or ethno-nationalism. It is a fact. And, I couldn't help thinking, with these sort of things that have been dredged up out of the Hungarian archives and, archives from other revisionist countries, they always say there's two sides to one story. And I'm sure, though it's, not officially recorded, as Koreans are polite people and they have a policy of non-interference, what the Koreans actually thought of some of the attitudes of the Soviet Union and other, and the revisionist countries. So anyway, and back to the whole main point. This whole idea of smearing the DPRK as racist, ethno-nationalist, or fascist, or even seen it said, DPRK is a National Socialist state. I believe Myers actually wrote this total rubbish. And by National Socialism, he doesn't mean socialism with strong national characteristics. He actually means Nazism, because Hitler used the term National Socialism, quite falsely. Hitler did so in order to try and compete with the communist and social democratic parties for votes, and he thought by calling him socialist, self-socialist, and putting national in front was a great idea, whereas in fact Hitler was nothing of the sort. And people who refer to the DPRK as fascist, of course, are very ignorant. They're typical ignorant postmodernist liberals, typical hipsters who come out with this kind of rubbish. They don't understand what fascism really means. And I think it's useful to look at the definition given by Georgy Dimitrov at the 7th Congress of the Comintern, where he defined it as the terrorist dictatorship of monopoly and finance capital in imperialist countries. And DPRK is a socialist country, it's not an imperialist country. There's no big companies or banks in the DPRK that could give rise to fascism. They don't exist in the DPRK. And moreover, the DPRK is actually a profoundly anti-fascist state. After liberation in the 1940s, the 20-point program, a platform that President Kim Il-sung announced included a ban on fascist parties. So the DPRK actually banned fascists. So how on earth can it be fascist? This idea is complete and utter nonsense. And lastly, the DPRK itself came about through the struggle against international fascism. It was part of the United International Front against fascism. President Kim Il-sung led the Korean people to fight for their independence against Japanese imperialism. And what was Japan? A fascist state. And in fact, not just the fascist state, but the Asian ally of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, and indeed one of the shock brigades of international fascism. And in fact, the atrocities committed by fascist Japanese imperialism were on an equal level with those committed in Europe by Nazi Germany. And in fact, you can argue that the crimes of the Japanese imperialists in Asia greatly exceeded the crimes committed by the Nazis in Europe. So the DPRK was actually the product, the heritage of anti-fascist struggle. It's as simple as that. So, this, latest urban myth or urban legend about the DPRK is yet another product of the awful anti-DPRK propaganda. And we Juche idea followers and true friends of people's career have a duty to combat it and smash it. Thank you for listening. If you like our channel, please subscribe to it. Please come to the events of the Juche Idea Study Group of England and the UK Korean Friendship Association. Thank you.